The intercom at the gate of the Sovereign didn't just crackle with static. It crackled with the specific frequency of my father's disdain. I stood there in the biting Chicago wind holding a pumpkin cheesecake with a spiced crust that had taken me 48 hours to perfect. Through the iron bars, the estate looked like a fortress of golden light. I could see them in the bay window, my sister Olivia and my best friend Chloe clinking glasses laughing at a joke I wasn't allowed to hear. "Go home, Victoria," my father's voice rasped from the speaker, metallic and final. "You are a liability. We don't have a seat for you." The gate didn't open. The click of the intercom cutting off sounded like a judge's gavel. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just nodded to the security camera, turned around, and walked back to my car. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I placed the cheesecake on the passenger seat of my sedan. It sat there like a passenger made of shame, a tangible monument to my own stupidity. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, watching the mansion disappear in the rearview mirror. I didn't cry. Crying implies surprise, and looking back, nothing about this should have been surprising. The silence in the car was heavy, but it gave me space to analyze the data. Why had I done it? Why had I spent 2 days baking a peace offering for people who had spent 3 decades treating me like a dull instrument they kept in the shed? I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and I forced myself to dissect the psychology of my own compliance. It wasn't just hope. It was science. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It is the most powerful training tool in existence, used to create addiction in everything from lab rats to gamblers. If you give a rat a pellet every time it presses a lever, it presses it only when it is hungry. But if you give the pellet randomly, if the rat never knows which press will deliver the reward, it will press that lever until it starves to death. That was my childhood. That was my relationship with Richard and Patricia. They didn't starve me of affection entirely. That would have made leaving easy. Instead, they gave me crumbs. A compliment on a report card when I was 10. A rare hug when I secured a zoning permit for them last year. Those tiny, unpredictable pellets of validation kept me pressing the lever, kept me baking cheesecakes, kept me fixing their messes, hoping that this time, this specific press would be the one that unlocked the love I was desperate for. But tonight, looking at that cake sliding slightly on the leather seat, as I took a sharp turn, the mechanism broke. I realized I wasn't a daughter to them. I was just a rat in a cage they had built out of guilt and obligation. And the most pathetic part was that I had helped them build it. I had poured the concrete of my own prison by believing that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just useful enough, the reinforcement would become consistent. It never would. My utility to them had expired the moment I started asking questions about the structural integrity of their new housing project. I wasn't a family member anymore. I was an auditor. And auditors don't get invited to Thanksgiving. The hurt that had been pooling in my chest began to cool, hardening into something else entirely. It wasn't sadness. Sadness is passive. This was cold, clarifying anger. It felt less like a breakdown and more like a system reboot. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 11:51 p.m. The day was almost over, but my work was just beginning. I had spent 30 years trying to build a foundation on quicksand. It was time to stop building and start demolishing. I pulled the car over on a deserted stretch of Lakeshore Drive. The water was a black void to my right, the city a wall of indifference to my left. My phone lit up on the center console, buzzing against the leather like an angry insect. It wasn't an apology. I knew that before I even looked. Richard didn't apologize. He escalated. I picked up the device. A text from my father. "We found the discrepancies in the structural assessments for the Harbor Point project. We know you authorized the Grade B steel. We are preparing a statement. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I stared at the words. They weren't just cutting me out. They were pinning the crimes of a $500 million housing project on me. They were going to send me to prison to save their profit margins. Then a notification from Instagram. Patricia. My mother. She had posted a photo taken just minutes ago. The dining room table at the Sovereign was set with crystal and silver. The legacy and loyalty plaque hung prominently on the wall above the roast turkey. Seated around it were Richard, Olivia, and Chloe, all raising glasses of vintage Cabernet. The caption read, grateful for a circle of trust. No weak links this year. The last tether of guilt inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the quiet, metallic click of a safety being disengaged. I didn't feel heartbreak. I didn't feel the urge to cry or scream or drive back there and beg for mercy. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. They had shown me their hand. They were betting that I was weak. They were betting that I would take the fall to protect the family name because that's what I had always done. They were wrong. I reached into the back seat and grabbed my laptop bag. I didn't open the work computer. They would have remote wiped that by now. I opened my personal laptop, a machine that had never touched the company server but held a mirror image of every drive I had accessed for the last 3 years. I navigated to a folder buried deep in the system architecture labeled simply Insurance. Inside were the seismic soil reports for Harbor Point, the real ones. The ones that showed the land was unstable, essentially liquefaction zones that would turn to soup in a minor tremor. The ones Richard had ordered me to bury. I had told him no. I thought he had listened. Now I knew he had just found someone else to say yes, and he was going to say it was my signature on the approval. I pulled up the contact for the FBI Anti-Corruption Unit. I had met Agent Miller at a compliance seminar 2 years ago. He had given me his card, joking that in my industry I might need it someday. I hadn't laughed then. I wasn't laughing now. I dialed the number. It rang twice. Miller, a gruff voice, answered. Agent Miller, this is Victoria Matthews, I said. My voice didn't shake. I have the seismic reports for Harbor Point. And I have the email chain where my father explicitly acknowledged the soil instability before ordering the steel downgrade. I'm ready to talk. We met 40 minutes later at a 24-hour diner near the precinct. It was the kind of place that smelled of bleach and burnt coffee, a stark contrast to the mahogany and leather of my father's study, but it felt cleaner. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slid the encrypted drive across the Formica table. The fraud isn't just financial. I told him, watching him plug it into his secure tablet. It's structural. They bribed the zoning commissioner to bypass the deep foundation requirement. They are building high-density, low-income housing on a foundation of wet sand using steel that becomes brittle below freezing. The first Chicago winter wind will shear the supports. It won't just be a bankruptcy, it will be a mass casualty event. Miller scrolled through the data, his face hardening. And they're pinning the authorization on you. My father texted me tonight claiming I authorized the Grade B steel, I said. He's going to say I went rogue to cut costs for a performance bonus. We need to prove it wasn't you, Miller said. We need to see who actually applied the digital seal to those blueprints. I pulled up the system logs on my screen. I've been tracking the metadata. The seal was applied on October 14th at 3 a.m. I was in London at a conference, but the login used my biometric ID. Miller frowned. How? That's what I need to find out. I started digging into the cloud sync logs for that night. I filtered by IP address. The access didn't come from the office. It came from a residential IP in the Gold Coast neighborhood. I traced the device ID. It wasn't my father's computer. It was an iPad registered to Chloe, my best friend, the head of PR. I felt a cold spike in my chest, but I pushed it down. I needed more. I accessed a shared photo stream Chloe and I had used for a project years ago, one she had forgotten to revoke my access to. I scrolled back to October. There were no photos of work. There were photos of a weekend trip to Aspen. Chloe was there. And so was Olivia. They weren't just friends. In one photo, they were kissing by a fireplace. In another taken just 2 weeks ago, they were toasting with champagne. And on Olivia's finger was a massive diamond ring, not an engagement ring from a man, but a custom design I recognized. I zoomed in on the caption of a hidden album, The Empire Plan. The puzzle pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just corporate scapegoating. This was a coup. Chloe wasn't just an employee. She was my sister's secret fiancé. They had been together for 2 years, playing me, gathering my passwords, and plotting to frame me so they could push me out and inherit the empire together. I looked up at Agent Miller. I know how they did it. I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, detached, clinical. And I know who helped them. Who? Chloe. She bypassed my biometrics. She's sleeping with my sister. They've been planning this for years. It wasn't a dagger in the back. It was a data point. It was the final variable in the equation. I closed the laptop. I can get them to admit it, I said. I can get them on tape. Miller looked at me assessing. If you go in there, you have to be stone. If you react, if you get emotional, they'll smell a rat. Don't worry, I said, picking up my cold coffee. I don't have any emotions left for them. I only have evidence. The call came 3 hours later. Richard didn't ask if I was free, he didn't ask if I was home. He simply stated that he was coming over and that we needed to settle the administrative errors regarding the Harbor Point project before the markets opened on Monday. I hung up and looked at Agent Miller, who was sitting at my small kitchen table adjusting the gain on a recording device. They're coming, I said. Good, Miller replied, checking the feed from the camera he had just concealed behind a stack of architectural journals on my bookshelf. Remember, get them to be specific. The problem isn't enough. You need them to say steal bribes or false reports. I know. And Victoria Miller paused, looking at me. If you feel unsafe, say the word contract. We'll come through that door in 3 seconds. I nodded. I didn't feel unsafe. I felt like a surgeon scrubbing in for an amputation. Necessary, bloody, and precise. They arrived at 8 p.m. sharp. The visual dissonance was striking. My apartment was a functional, minimalist space, clean lines, drafting tables, exposed brick. My family swept in like a flock of vultures dressed in Italian wool. Richard wore his boardroom armor, a charcoal suit that cost more than my car. Olivia was in cashmere, looking pale but defiant. And Chloe. Chloe wore the same coat she had worn in the Aspen photos, the ones where she was kissing my sister. They didn't sit. They prowled. Richard paced the length of the living room, checking the windows as if he expected paparazzi to be rappelling down the building. Olivia stood by, the door arms crossed, guarding the exit. Chloe walked toward me, her face arranged into a mask of concern that was so perfectly constructed it was almost impressive. We're in a crisis mode, Victoria. Richard started turning on his heel to face me. The zoning commission is asking questions. The press is sniffing around the soil samples. We need a narrative control strategy, and we need it tonight. I leaned against my drafting table, crossing my ankles. I thought I was a liability, Richard. Why are you here? Because we're generous, Olivia snapped. Because despite your incompetence, we're willing to help you. Richard held up a hand to silence her. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal paper. He tossed it onto the table between us. It landed with a heavy thud. This is an affidavit, he said, his voice dropping to that low, persuasive register he used to close deals. It states that due to extreme pressure to meet deadlines and secure performance bonuses, you acted independently to source alternative materials for the Harbor Point Foundation. It states that you bypassed the standard approval chain to authorize the purchase of the Grade B steel. I looked at the document, then at him. You want me to confess to construction fraud. We want you to take responsibility for your department, Richard corrected Smoothie. In exchange, the family is prepared to offer a severance package that reflects your unique situation. He pulled a check from his pocket and placed it on top of the affidavit. $10 million. The number was written in his sharp, aggressive handwriting. 10 million, I said flatly. That's the price of a scapegoat these days. It's a golden parachute, Chloe said, stepping closer. Her voice was soft, intimate, the voice of the friend who had held my hair back when I had the flu, the voice of the woman who had stolen my fingerprints. Think about it. You can go anywhere. You can start your own firm in Europe. You can finally get out of Richard's shadow. Isn't that what you always wanted? I looked at her. I looked at the eyes that had lied to me for 2 years without blinking. You think I should take it? I think you need a fresh start, Chloe said, reaching out to touch my arm. I didn't flinch, but every nerve ending in my body recoiled. We're trying to protect you. If this goes to court without a controlled narrative, the investigation could drag on for years. It would destroy the company. It would destroy the legacy. Do it for the family, Vic. The legacy, I repeated. I looked at Richard. If I sign this, the company is in the clear. The company survives, Richard said. We pay a fine for oversight failure. We replace the steel. You won't replace the steel, I cut in. The foundation is already poured. To replace the steel, you'd have to tear down the South Tower. That's a $40 million loss. Richard's eyes narrowed. That is a business decision, Victoria, not yours. So you're going to leave it, I said, keeping my voice level. You know the soil is unstable. You saw the seismic reports in June. I sent them to you. You know that steel will shear if the ground temperature drops below 10 degrees. The soil reports were inconclusive, Richard shouted, his composure cracking. And the steel is structurally sufficient for the load. It was a calculated risk management decision. A risk you authorized, I asked. I authorized the budget cuts, Richard roared. I authorized the timeline. I am the CEO. I make the decisions that keep this empire standing. You were supposed to make the paperwork match the reality, not lecture me on geology. There it was. Admission of knowledge. Admission of command. And the digital seal, I asked, turning to Olivia. The one on the approval orders, did Richard authorize that too? Olivia sneered. Someone had to be the adult in the room. You were too busy playing moral crusader to sign the orders, so we handled it. It's done, Victoria. The concrete is dry. Now sign the damn paper and take the money. We handled it, I echoed. I looked at Chloe. Chloe hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. I just helped Olivia with the logistics. We were just trying to keep the project moving. By using my biometric ID while I was in London, I asked. Chloe went still. The concern vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp look of a predator realizing the cage door has shut. How do you know? That she whispered. Because I'm detail-oriented, I said. That's why you hired me, right, to fix things. I looked at the check again. $10 million. It was a lot of money. It was enough to buy a new life. It was also a bribe to facilitate manslaughter. I have one question, I said, looking at Richard. When the building falls, when people get hurt, were you planning to send me a card in prison? Don't be dramatic, Richard scoffed, adjusting his cufflinks. It's low-income housing, Victoria. The standards are flexible. Nobody is going to prison. You sign this. You plead out to negligence. You do 6 months of probation and you retire to a villa in Tuscany. It's a business transaction. Stop making it emotional. You're right, I said. It is a business transaction. I picked up the check. I looked at it for a long moment, letting them think they had won. Letting them breathe that sigh of relief that comes when money solves the problem. Then I tore it in half. And then in half again. I dropped the confetti onto the table. The problem with your offer, Richard? I said, my voice ringing in the silent room, is that you're trying to buy something I don't have for sale. What the hell do you want? Olivia screeched. 20? You want 20 million. I don't want your money, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was the one from Aspen. Chloe and Olivia toasting with champagne, the ring sparkling on Olivia's finger. I tossed it onto the pile of torn paper. I know, I said. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. All the oxygen left the room. Olivia looked at the photo, then at Chloe, then at me. Chloe looked at the floor. I know about the engagement, I said. I know about the plan. And I know you needed a scapegoat to clear the board before you announced the succession. Richard looked at the photo, confusion warring with rage on his face. What is this? This is the end of the transaction, I said. I looked at the bookshelf. Agent Miller, I think we're done here. Agent Miller stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his badge glinting under the track lighting. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply raised his radio and said one word. Execute. The front door of my apartment burst open. It wasn't a dramatic kick. It was a precise, tactical entry. 6 uniformed FBI agents flooded the room, their movements synchronized and efficient. The air in the room shifted instantly from the heavy, suffocating tension of a family argument to the sharp, metallic reality of federal law enforcement. Federal agents, nobody move. Olivia screamed a high, piercing sound that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with indignation. Chloe stumbled back against the drafting table, her face draining of color, until she looked like a wax figure. Richard didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at Agent Miller, his brain unable to process a situation where he wasn't the highest authority in the room. Richard Matthews Miller said, walking forward with a pair of handcuffs, "You are under arrest for wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to commit gross negligence resulting in public endangerment." "This is a mistake," Richard said. His voice was shaking, but he tried to summon the boardroom baritone that had terrorized board members for decades. Do you know who I am? I can have your badge before morning. I want Milovier. Your lawyer is currently being indicted for aiding and abetting, Miller said, snapping the cuffs onto Richard's wrists. And as of 3 minutes ago, your assets have been frozen under the RICO Act. That was the moment. I watched it happen in slow motion. Richard didn't flinch when the metal touched his skin. He flinched when Miller said the words, "Assets frozen." His phone buzzed in his pocket. Then Olivia's, then Chloe's. It was a synchronized chorus of notifications, bank alerts, credit monitoring systems, and automated messages from offshore accounts, signaling a lockout. Richard looked down at his pocket, unable to reach it. His chest hitched. The imposing titan of industry posture collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward, his jaw went slack, and his eyes darted around the room with the frantic, wet panic of a cornered animal. I had always wondered why powerful men who built empires and crushed competitors without blinking, fell apart so completely the moment the money was touched. Standing there, watching my father shrink into a terrified old man in a tailored suit, I finally understood. There is a distinct difference between having power and being powerful. My father had power, but it was external. It was a suit of armor made of bank accounts, influence, and leverage. He rented his confidence. He leased his authority. But underneath that armor, there was no muscle. There was no character. There was no self. It is the illusion of the empty wallet. When you strip a narcissist of their financial shield, you aren't just taking their money, you are evicting them from their own identity. Without the ability to buy his way out of consequences, Richard Matthews didn't exist. He was a hollow shell that had been propped up by a checkbook. And now that the checkbook was closed, the shell was imploding under the weight of gravity. He looked at me. For the first time in my life, there was no judgment in his eyes. There was no calculation. There was only naked, pathetic fear. "Victoria," he wheezed. "Fix this." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had taught me that love was conditional and that value was transactional. "I can't," I said. "My department doesn't handle this." Miller guided him toward the door. Olivia was next. As an agent pulled her arms behind her back, she turned on Chloe. "You said this was safe," she shrieked, her face contorted. "You said she wouldn't find out?" Chloe didn't look at her. She was staring at the floor, calculating. I could see the gears turning. She wasn't thinking about Olivia. She wasn't thinking about the engagement. She was thinking about a plea deal. The loyalty they had preached, the legacy they had killed for it, evaporated the second the handcuffs clicked. "Victoria, please," Chloe whispered, as she was led past me. I was just doing what they told me. I didn't respond. I just watched them go. One by one, the architects of my misery were escorted out of my sanctuary. The noise of the raid faded, leaving only the open door and the cool night air drifting in from the hallway. Agent Miller stopped in the doorway. "We have the recordings, we have the confession, we have the evidence of the biometric bypass. You're clear, Victoria. You're a witness, not a suspect." "Thank you," I said. "We'll need you at the station for a formal statement tomorrow," he said. "Get some sleep, it's over." He closed the door. I stood in the center of my living room. The confetti of the $10 million check was still scattered on the floor. The photo of the engagement ring lay face up on the table. My apartment was silent. It was a clean, heavy silence. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. I saw the flashing lights of the federal vehicles. I saw my father being guided into the back of an SUV, his head bowed, to avoid the cameras that had already started to gather. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt light. It was the feeling of setting down a heavy pack you hadn't realized you were carrying until the straps cut into your shoulders. They were gone. They couldn't hurt me. They couldn't frame me. And most importantly, they couldn't make me feel small anymore. I turned away from the window and looked at my reflection in the darkened glass. I looked tired, but I looked real. I wasn't a Matthews anymore. I was just Victoria, and for the first time, that was enough. The collapse of the Matthews empire wasn't a landslide, it was a controlled demolition. The news cycle didn't just report the fraud, they devoured the legacy. Within 48 hours, the name Matthews went from a golden ticket in Chicago real estate to a synonym for corruption. The Sovereign was seized by the federal government 3 weeks later. I drove past it once, seeing the foreclosure notices taped to those massive iron gates. The lights were off. The golden glow was gone. It looked exactly like what it was, a cold, empty box made of expensive stone. Chloe didn't even wait for the arraignment to turn on Olivia. Her lawyer cut a deal before the ink was dry on her arrest warrant. She handed over everything, the encrypted chats, the shared calendars, the photos of their engagement. The great love story that was supposed to steal my inheritance ended in a deposition room, with Chloe pointing a finger at my sister to shave 2 years off her sentence. I never went to visit Richard. He called from the detention center once. I saw the collect call notification on my phone, stared at it for 5 seconds, and then blocked the number. I didn't need closure. I didn't need an apology. I had the seismic reports. That was all the truth I needed. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle, it was watching the demolition at Harbor Point. I stood on the sidewalk in the freezing wind and watched the cranes tear down the South Tower. It was painful to see the steel twist and fall, but it was necessary. You can't fix a building that has poison in its veins. You have to tear it down to the dirt and start over. And that's what I did. 1 year later, Thanksgiving arrived again. But this time there was no wind biting through my coat. There was no intercom crackling with rejection. I stood in the kitchen of my new bungalow. It was a third of the size of my old apartment and a fraction of the size of the Sovereign, but it was mine. The heating worked. The foundation was solid. I pulled a pumpkin cheesecake out of the oven. The crust was spiced perfectly. The surface was uncracked. The doorbell rang. I didn't flinch. I didn't check a camera. I just walked to the door and opened it. Agent Miller David now was standing there holding a bottle of wine. Behind him were 2 of the junior architects from my new firm, people who cared about soil density and safety standards more than profit margins. "Smells good," David said, stepping inside. "It's a new recipe," I smiled. "Come in." We sat around a table that I had built myself. There were no legacy and loyalty plaques on the wall. There were just photos of my friends, my travels, and the new projects we were building the right way. As I sliced the cheesecake, I looked around the table. I realized that for 30 years I had been starving at a banquet, begging for scraps. Now, I was full. I want to say something to those of you who are still standing outside the gate. I know you're out there. I know you're holding your own version of a pumpkin cheesecake, waiting for someone to open the door and finally see you. There is a pervasive lie we tell ourselves about family. We tell ourselves that walking away is an act of weakness. We tell ourselves that if we were just stronger, if we were just more patient, if we just baked a better cake, they would change. But walking away isn't quitting, it is surviving. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. You cannot build a safe life on a foundation that is actively trying to collapse under you. Cutting ties with toxic family is not an act of hate. It is an act of aggressive self-preservation. It is the only way to prove to yourself that you are not a liability. You are the asset. You are the prize. And you deserve a table where you don't have to audition for a seat. If this story reminded you of your own strength, please like and subscribe. And if you've ever had to build your own table because the one you were born at was broken, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. You are not alone.